Welcome back. Last time we actually dived deep into the Bible talking about the Sabbath truth and what exactly it means for us. Was it just a law that was instituted for the Jews, or is it also for Christians? What evidence do we find in the New Testament? Last time we covered upwards of 30 Bible verses, guys. There's a lot to go through. And this time we're going to continue that study and kind of see where it takes us. So let's just jump into it and continue our study. Isaiah 58 talks about turning thy foot away from the Sabbath, from doing my pleasure on my holy day. Does this mean that you can't have any pleasure and that the Sabbath can't be a joy? What do you guys think?
No, the Sabbath was created for pleasure. However, we're not to have our own pleasure on the Sabbath, according to this text.
So how do you quantify that? If it's made for pleasure, do you have any verses? Does anything come to mind that supports that notion?
Well, just from a practical perspective, I think of it like this. If you're going out on a date, you don't go out on a date and then go off to the side and go play a video game.
Okay, that's a good analogy.
Like you don't go and have your own fun off to the side. The whole purpose of that is to spend time with the other person.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So basically you're saying that self-focused pursuits like self-entertainment, self-pleasure would be wrong then.
Yeah, well, I guess the question would be, where does true pleasure come from? It only comes from God.
Right.
And so we find true pleasure in spending time with God.
Right.
And so, you could say our own pleasure is the pleasures that we get from this world.
Mm-hmm.
And the pleasure that the Sabbath was created for was for a loving relationship with God, who is the source of all pleasure.
So in the New Testament, we also find there's multiple mentions of the Sabbath. One of the most poignant ones is probably talking about after Jesus' death on Friday. And it says, when the Sabbath was passed, and it mentions a few people, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and that they brought spices and that they were going to anoint him very early in the morning, the first day of the week. They came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. So I've heard some people say that Jesus didn't die on a Friday and he didn't, that they try and shift the whole crucifixion story earlier in the week. They say, he died on a Wednesday or a Thursday or something like that. But, it's very clearly saying on the first day of the week, that's when they came.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's saying that the Sabbath was passed, this is the New Testament, and then it says on the first day of the week after the Sabbath was passed, then logically, which day is the Sabbath?
The seventh.
Not the first day, right?
Yeah.
Because it says when the Sabbath was passed and on the first day.
Mm-hmm.
So here in the New Testament, the Sabbath is mentioned as being the seventh day still. So then that logically follows for everyone, right? That the Sabbath is the seventh day, and the first day, per this text, would be the day after the Sabbath, right?
Yep.
So if we go on to John 14, verse 15, there's a command here, if you love me, keep my commandments. Now, how many commandments does Jesus give in the New Testament? He says there's really two of them.
Mm-hmm.
What are those two? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your fellow man as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So is that the new covenant? Does that mean that we no longer have to follow the previous moral law, the Ten Commandments?
Well, it said upon these to hang all the law and the prophets. So clearly it's kind of like a structure there where those two are the central pillars, but everything else goes along with it. So the law and the prophets and everything else is connected with that.
If you break up the first four and the last six, is that kind of where you're...
Right. So if you look at the moral law, so if it says on these two hang all the law and the prophets, the first four teach us how to love God.
Exactly.
Because it's all relating to God.
Mm-hmm.
Don't have any other gods before me. Don't make any idols. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. Keep holy the Sabbath day.
Right.
So that's our duty and our relation to God. The last six teach us how to love our fellow man.
Yep.
Don't murder him. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't do all these things that are going to harm your fellow man.
Right.
And the first six are actually flow out of the first four. Because if you love God, you're going to respect his creation.
Mm-hmm.
And if he created another free will being, you're going to respect that other free will being. Does that follow?
Yep.
So when it says here, if you love me, keep my commandments, we don't have to define that further by saying, oh, well, it's the 10 commandments versus just loving the Lord, because they're one and the same. It should be synonymous, basically, if that makes sense.
Yep.
In Psalms 89, verse 34, it says, my covenant will I not break nor alter the thing that has gone out of my lips. So if he says something, if a law comes out of his lips, is he going to alter it?
Yeah, no,
He
the only
can't.
one that alters that covenant, or tries to at least, is the little horn of Daniel 7.
Who will seek to change times and laws?
Yeah, exactly. That's the only one that tries to alter it.
Yeah. Because
And
God is
actually-
the same yesterday, today, and forever.
Right.
He does not change.
Yeah.
Right.
And Christ actually confirms this, in Matthew 5:17 and 18, where till heaven and earth pass, not one jot nor tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
So this concept here was affirmed even in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
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 Now, there is some people would say that text that you just mentioned says, until all these be fulfilled, and that it was fulfilled in Christ at the cross, and therefore after that.
Yeah, but heaven
Yeah.
and earth haven't passed.
Exactly, yeah.
Also the problem with that is it's in the same block of stone that has thou shalt not murder. Nobody has an issue saying, oh, you shouldn't murder.
Mhm.
You won't find a Christian alive that's like, oh yeah, no, it's fine to go murder somebody.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the one commandment that starts with remember, that they're like, oh, well, that one, we don't need to do that.
Unless they try and couch it in terms of it's okay to get rid of a heretic.
Well, that's true. You do find some people that try and twist it a little bit there. Again, you guys were talking about till heaven and earth shall pass. So it's easier for creation to pass than the smallest portion of God's law to pass or to fail.
Yeah, when I first became a Christian and I was reading the Bible and I started to understand the Sabbath, and I read this text,
Mhm.
I just read it and I thought to myself, well, I'm still standing on the earth and the heavens are there, so I was like, this has got to be valid still, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. James 4:17. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. So if you know what to do and you know it's right and you fail to do that, does that separate you from God?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so obedience to the law is not just a command to do something, but you can also be guilty by failing to do your duty as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Inaction is an action. in and
Yeah,
of
this is
itself.
sin of omission.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Isaiah 59 talks about how our iniquities have separated us from God. It says that our sins have hidden his face from us. And so you think about that. It's like, why don't we see God today? Because if we did see him, you would cease to exist, right? I mean, Moses was put in the cleft of the rock. I mean, he was up there, 40 days fasting and praying. I mean, they had to confess all their sins. When the high priest went into the most holy place where the presence of God was, all the sins had to be confessed or you drop dead, right? Moses was put in the cleft of the rock and he only saw the backside of God pass before him. So sin is what separates us. Sin is what has put that veil in place. And if we're breaking it in one tiny minutia, that's what continues that separation. And if we continue in that separation, eventually it separates us permanently. Revelation 22 verse 14 talks about the commandments. Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates into the city.
Wait. You're saying we don't go with the NIV version that says, blessed are they which wash their robes?
You do see, we need to do a video about that, actually, the NIV versus KJV, and go through some of the points there, because that would be very interesting. But yeah, you're right. This is one of those that gets changed.
Yeah, you're looking at, I think, what is it, the Septuagint, the Sinaiticus?
The Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus, yeah.
Yeah, kind of going back through that chain of Greek manuscripts instead of the The
Text is
received
receptive.
text, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So those who keep God's commandments, which commandments? We're here in the last chapter, the last book of the Bible, in the last chapter of the Bible, the very, very end. And it's blessed are they that do his commandments, because they're the ones that have a right to the tree of life.
Mm-hmm.
Don't we all want that? That's what our ultimate goal should be, right? Is to spend time with God and ultimately to win eternal life. And the only way we do that is by keeping his commandments.
What would you say to someone who says, I'm not capable of keeping his commandments, but that's okay?
We're not capable of keeping his commandments on our own.
Mm-hmm.
But when we have Christ living within us, it becomes possible.
yeah, so kind of
Mhm.
going back to, we recently discussed at our church Galatians 3, and, there's, in the first part of Galatians 3, there's a question that Paul asks, like, can you be perfected by the flesh? Like, and the answer to that is obviously no. I mean, the flesh can do nothing,
Mm-hmm.
but with God's Spirit, then there is power to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
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 Exactly.
So, Isaiah 66, verse 23 talks, and it says, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. So this verse is really telling us that in the new earth, we're going to be keeping the Sabbath, right?
Mm-hmm.
Brian, what do you think of this next text? Acts 17, verse 2.
And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the scriptures.
So how does that play into Sabbath observance in the New Testament? Is Paul, going on a Sunday and being like, no, guys, you got it all wrong,
No, of course not. No.
I like it that it
No,
says
that's not.
as his manner was. I mean, it's like, it's pretty well established
Yeah.
to have it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it mirrors Christ's example in Luke 4:16, where Christ, as his custom was, goes in the synagogue and stands up to preach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or what about this verse right here?
And now when Paul and his company loosed from Paphos, they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem. But when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down.
Mm.
What I find interesting about all of these accounts in the New Testament of Paul and any of the apostles going and preaching on the Sabbath is that there's not a single place in the Bible where there's a question on the day of worship.
No.
Not even amongst the Gentiles. It's not like, just as Brian mentioned before, there's not a case where Paul has to correct somebody because they're worshiping on the wrong day.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was generally accepted.
Mm-hmm.
When Paul was worshiping, when he was teaching them on the Sabbath day, he didn't say, "Hey guys, come back tomorrow on the first day."
Mm-hmm.
On Sunday. He didn't say, "Make sure you don't gather together next Sunday" or anything. There was just no question about it. There's no mention of it because they just all met on the Sabbath day.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point. It's a common theme for the justification of worshiping on Sunday is, well, we observe Sunday out of respect for the resurrection. Well, if that was the case, then why are there no examples of the disciples doing so immediately afterwards?
But the claim is that Paul went in to preach to those Jews, to proselytize to them, to bring them into the Christian church. And he wasn't there to actually keep the Sabbath. That's the claim, right?
But where do you
That's,
find that in the scripture, though? It's completely missing.
Yeah.
No, I mean, if you go to Acts 13 and 18, you find where he's speaking to Greeks and Gentiles on the day. So it's clearly not just exclusive to Jews that he's trying to preach, but also to Greeks and Gentiles as well.
And that's a very common thing you see with what I would consider faulty doctrine is they take like one verse or like one small thing and just blow it out of context. Whereas if you read the full chapter or you compare verse to verse, that's obviously not the case. The Bible doesn't contradict itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And on the Sabbath, we went out of the city by a riverside where prayer was wont to be made, and we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted thither, So, it's interesting here that it's not just the synagogue that he's going to on the Sabbath day, but just basically a group of Christians wherever on the Sabbath day. So this was not necessarily exclusive to, hey, I'm going to go proselytize in the synagogue, but I'm going to go meet with people because it's the Sabbath day.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
What's interesting is if you look at the New King James Version of this verse, that word want right there, it's actually substituted with customarily, where prayer was customarily to be made. So, we're talking about like, this is going on. This is not just like, oh, we did this one time type thing.
Mm-hmm.
Acts 18, verse 4, and he referencing Paul, reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. Just like you were saying, he's not just talking to the Jews. He's talking to anybody who's going to listen to him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Then in Mark 2:27 it says, and he, being Jesus, said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath.
mm-hmm. So it's universal.
It's a universal blessing for all mankind.
Notice what it doesn't say. Okay. It doesn't say, and he, Jesus, said unto them, the Sabbath was made for Jews and not Jews for the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
It also, New Testament speak, a lot of times it'll refer to Jews as the circumcised,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll refer to everybody else, the Gentiles, as uncircumcised. It also doesn't say, and he, Jesus, said unto them, the Sabbath was made for the circumcised and not the circumcised for the Sabbath. It doesn't say the Sabbath was made for women and not women for the Sabbath. It's referencing all of mankind.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And actually, the first man to benefit from the Sabbath, which was instituted at creation, was Adam. And he wasn't, we wouldn't call him like a Jew per se, right?
Yeah.
So long before Abraham even.
Mhm.
He wasn't even, Abraham himself wasn't even born yet.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's a special thing. I mean, God obviously recognized that there was a need for that we needed this, and without this, there would be, some sort of, not consequence, but I guess you could say maybe consequence as well, that it was a necessity for humanity to have the Sabbath in that time.
Even Martin Luther recognized that had Adam not fallen, his position in his work In Genesis and Rationes was that Adam would have taught his children on the Sabbath day, like instructed them in righteousness, and that it would have continued perpetually to be kept by Adam throughout the centuries. So Adam lost the rest by sinning. He lost the rest of Christ.
One thing that it boggles my mind is you look in Genesis and you have creation itself, the most impressive act in this galaxy that we've ever, that there wasn't even a galaxy here, right? The most impressive act, God rests on the seventh day. Nobody was there to witness it. There was no humans at that point other than Adam there to witness it. Nobody else was around to witness God resting on the seventh day. But then the Old Testament is littered with verses talking about the Sabbath. You have Mount Sinai where you have like fire coming down on the mountain for how long? I mean, they're camped there for like a long time. Like these thunder clouds are there with like lightning and fire and like just this awesome, impressive, space where all these people are bowed down with their faces in the dust, terrified. And they're like, no, you go talk to him. Like we don't want him talking to us again, right? Because he speaks to them first. And then they're like, no, Moses, you go. And you basically have like a continuous nuclear explosion practically at the top of this mountain for like a prolonged period. And you have the law given, written in stone. And then you have a prophecy in the Old Testament about how a little horn power would seek to change times and laws. Okay? But then look at the New Testament. Yeah, you have the apostles going and preaching in synagogues on the Sabbath day, but there is a complete and total lack of any mention of ever changing that law. It is entirely absent from the New Testament. There's nothing. It's like, shouldn't that absence of something speak volumes?
Should.
Yeah, and on that point, Jesus was around after his resurrection for quite some time, right? 40 days, right? That's a long time.
Mhm.
And there is, I mean, what did he teach them for the 40 days after he resurrected?
Not even one verse saying like, oh, by the way, guys.
I've changed this, I've changed that, this is a new commandment. None of that.
No.
None of it. Not a single. In 40 days, I mean, and you would think that, things were really intense during Christ's ministry,
Mhm.
and they intensified to the point that he was crucified. I mean, can you imagine after that, when he is resurrected, how intense the environment around those early Christians would have been,
Mhm.
and the need for them to learn whatever they could possibly learn. And there's not a single mention of anything that he taught them, because he'd already told them already. He had 3.5 years to teach them everything that he needed to teach them. And obviously, I mean, he would have taught them something in those 40 days, but it was nothing new.
Mhm.
It was nothing new.
Right.
Yeah.
When he already said previously that, like, he's not there to change one jot or one tittle. Like, he's not there to change the law; he's there to fulfill it. So,
Yep.
I mean, if he taught them something, if different, that would be impossible for him, right? He already established that he doesn't change; his laws don't change.
Isaiah 56 says, Blessed is the man that doeth this, and the Son of Man that layeth hold on it, that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and keeping his hand from doing any evil. Also the sons of the stranger that join themselves to the Lord to serve him, and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, every one that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and taketh hold of my covenant. Even them will I bring in to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar, for mine house shall be called an house of prayer for all people. The sons of the stranger, is that non-Israelites? It's not Jews,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And it's interesting, it says sons of the stranger,
Mm-hmm.
as if it's a perpetual thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
Right.
It's not
Yeah, yeah.
just.
It's not
It's
just
not
like
just the
one
stranger.
person.
It's the sons of the stranger, indicating a perpetuity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a blessing there that is ongoing all the way to our time, right?
Mm-hmm.
What about this verse, Brian?
So Acts 13:42 and 44, and when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. And the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to hear the word of God.
Almost the whole city.
That's
So
powerful.
is that just the Jews? Is
No,
it just the
certainly not.
Christians? No. It's everybody, right?
Yep. Hebrews 4:4-11. For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his works. And in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest, seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Again, he limiteth a certain day, saying in David, Today, after so long a time, as it is said, Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that is entered into his rest, he also hath ceased from his own works, as God did from his. Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief.
So we're looking at Paul here, thought to be the primary author of Hebrews, the same one that wrote Colossians 2, Romans 14. And he's teaching here to enter into that sabbatismos, that rest, in verse 10 and 9, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. The prophets of old warned Israel over and over and over about their failure to keep the Sabbath, their failure to enter into that rest. And he's teaching right here that we should enter that rest. We should actually rest on that day. But, did Christ ever speak of another day? I mean,
Nope.
Verse 8 asks a question. Was that ever spoken of? And, to answer that question, even like if we're responding to Catholicism, one of the things that they said at the Council of Trent, January 18, 1562, was Archbishop Reggio in his sermon said that the change from Sabbath to Sunday was not based upon the teaching of Christ. I think it's non Christi predicatione cesarunt, something like that. It was not based upon the teaching of Christ that the change was made. Ergo, they're answering the question right here.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't because of Christ that the day was changed, but because they claimed church authority to change it.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, if we actually look at this verse right here, the Sabbath remains. Christ never changed it. They even admit it themselves.
Yep. To me, this is one of the most powerful verses, this whole section right here, because we're talking about something that is in the New Testament, not Old Testament, well after Christ's death, crucifixion, resurrection. Paul is talking, one of the most prolific authors in the New Testament, the most prolific author in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying, God did rest on the seventh day. Okay? Does he mention the first day anywhere else in here? No. Okay? Then if you go to verse 8, for if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? You're right, it's a question, and the answer is obvious. Yeah, of course he's going to speak of another day. Of course he's going to tell them. He's not going to leave them in darkness.
Well, actually, verse 10, he says, he also hath ceased from his own works as God did from his. The qualification of as God did from his is actually in verse 4, God rested on the seventh day. So if you actually are a follower of God, you're going to rest as he did on the seventh day.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't, then how can you enter that rest at the end of time? There's some people actually for centuries that looked at the 6,000 years of Earth's history followed by the 1,000-year millennium as a sort of sabbatical rest in heaven.
Mm.
You're not going to enter that seventh millennium. We could get fancy here with a day of
A day is as under the Lord as a thousand years.
and look at that as a sabbatical rest in heaven. How are you going to enter that rest in heaven if you have failed and disobeyed to enter that rest here according to the commandment of God?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that's really as fancy or a stretch at all. I think that's a very important concept to understand. I mean, we're in the preparation day right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
And it's interesting too, if you think about it, like all the saints are in heaven during that time period. The earth rests, the land rests. I mean,
that's
there's,
true.
There's
See,
nothing
it's-
down here except the devil chained.
See, now you're getting into the abomination of desolation, which we need to do a whole different series on, which is really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you could argue he's chained down here in a forced rest himself. I mean, he has no one to torment.
Yeah, I mean, obviously,
Mhm.
Revelation speaks about an angel coming down and taking that dragon and chaining him.
Right.
So
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yep.
What do you make of this verse, James?
Ezekiel 8, there are 4 abominations. We've got, actually, you've kind of skipped over some of the first 2 abominations, actually, in the verses preceding here.
Mhm.
But number 3 and number 4 are listed here, corresponding to commandment 3 and 4. You've got these women who are weeping for Tammuz.
Mm-hmm.
Tammuz, in ancient mythology, was supposedly the son of, Semiramis or something like that,
Mhm.
and, killed by a wild boar. So he died, and the claim was that he was resurrected and, went back to the heavens and so on. So these,
Well, it all goes back to Nimrod, essentially, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But here's these women weeping for Tammuz. They're kind of these are supposedly Israelites, but they're taking God's name in vain because even though they claim to be Israelites, they're worshiping Tammuz. They're taking another name instead of the name of God. So they're blaspheming. And then commandment number 4 is broken by sun worship. They're worshiping the sun.
Their backs toward the temple and their face toward the east, and they worship the sun.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And sun worship, actually, if you go back through some of the evidence of the ancient religions, was worshipped on Sunday, if you will, the first day of the week, going way back, even before like Rome. This went way back in the ancient religions. So this was a very, very ancient abomination, and it there were 4 mentioned in Ezekiel here that correspond to the first 4 commandments of God's law. So also do we find 4 in Revelation 14 as well. Worship to the beast, commandment number 1 violated. An image to the beast, commandment 2. The name of the beast, commandment 3. And then the mark of the beast, commandment 4.
But okay, some people probably watching this are like, okay, I was following you until this verse, and then you completely lost me how this has to do anything with the Sabbath. Okay? How does this have to do with the Sabbath commandment specifically?
Well, Ezekiel, the surrounding evidence in the book of Ezekiel, there's quite a lot of evidence about the Sabbath being this sign, if you will. Ezekiel 8 and 9 correspond really closely with Revelation 13 and 14 in some critical areas, and specifically the 4 abominations with the 4, warnings contained in the 3 angels' messages. But what I want to focus on here is the fact that the abomination here is sun worship. Okay, that's the 4th abomination right here.
So how does sun worship equate to the Sabbath?
Well, it's a very close connection to the the crisis at the end of time with Sunday observance and the mark of the beast. Ezekiel goes on in 9 and chapter 20 to explain this crisis where the angels go around looking for this seal on everybody's forehead, right? And the seal, if you have it, you're saved from the destroying angel. Well, he defines what that sign or seal is in Ezekiel 20, verse 12, and 20, verse 20, as God's seventh-day Sabbath. So this life-saving seal or mark or sign is defined in Ezekiel 9 as the true, a marker for true worship. But there's a warning in Revelation 14 about a mark of the beast, okay? And if you have that on your forehead, you get the plagues. Well, Ezekiel's just defined right here in the previous chapter the first 4 violations of God's law, one of them being sun worship. Mm-hmm. If you look at the parallels between this and Revelation 14, it becomes abundantly obvious that the connection here of true worship to God is defined as keeping those first 4 commandments of how we ought to express our love to Him, as well as the final 6 towards His creation. But in this case, I think that the sun worship piece itself really provides us further evidence on Revelation 14 as far as what the mark of the beast is. It's a counterfeit of what God's sign is, which Ezekiel defines and later on for 9 and chapter 20.
And I'll read that, Ezekiel 20 and 12. I think we discussed this a little bit in part 1, but you get to go over it again. It says, it's very clear. I mean, I don't know how you could be more clear. Moreover, also I give them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. I mean, that's crystal clear.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, the sign, the same Hebrew word there, oth, okay, for sign, you find in Exodus 13:9 and Deuteronomy 6 through 8, where God's law is to be like this sign is to be on your forehead and then on your hand. So God wants His law to mark our characters, our thoughts, and our actions, what we do with our hands. And if we don't have that, then we're going to either have the mark of the beast in the hand through your actions or through in your mind through mental assent.
Yeah.
So I think this verse becomes more clear, though, when you understand more of the history of how Sunday started to be reverenced. And, after we get done with looking at all the Bible texts in this short little series, we're going to delve into the history of the Sabbath since the Bible was written. And we're going to go through each century until we've arrived at modern day and look at all the old sources. But one of the things that's interesting is in Rome, the ancient pagan religion was to worship the god Sol Invictus, which was the sun god. They worshiped the sun, okay? And they worshiped him on Sunday, right?
Yeah.
And so the high priest's name that was the pagan priest, basically, in that religion, was Pontifex Maximus Sol Invictus. And so it was the high priest of the god Sol Invictus, basically. And so if you look at this here, and it's talking about sun worship, well, why would you reverence a day that the pagans are worshiping by worshiping Sol Invictus? And so there isn't an equating of it there.
Now, what we're not saying here is that you cannot worship God in the sense of, your morning and evening devotions and spending time with Him and having a prayer meeting and meeting like the apostles did on Acts 20, verse 7 on the first day of the week. They gathered and they met house to house. In Acts 2, verse 46, breaking bread daily. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about elevating one day by resting from all your labor and dedicating that day in, as the commandment states, in holiness to God. In Exodus 20, and setting it apart as distinct from all the other days. I believe it was the same prophet Ezekiel who warned about the priests who had made no distinction between the holy and the common. And I think that there's a lot of people today that think, well, I can worship God any day I want to. And so what does that practically translate in their lives? They're working or having parties or doing whatever, and it's really not anything that's set aside as holy. Mm-hmm. It's just, I do what I want. That's what it really boils down to.
Well, how many Sunday keepers out there today will go to church and then they go out to eat afterwards, and then they might go mow their lawn or watch football or do whatever else, They're not really keeping the day holy.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not really not working or anything. They're doing whatever they want. They're doing their pleasure, not even on His holy day, just on any day they pick, right?
Yeah. We've got to remember as well, though, that this is a difficult subject for people because people have grown up their entire lives. Their parents, their grandparents, they all kept Sunday, mm-hmm. and they've grown up doing the same thing. And so it's not a matter of, I guess, who's right and wrong, but what does God's law say, right? And what does God want from His subjects? Mm-hmm. He wants obedience, right? And what's the reason that He wants obedience? It's not because He's overpowering and controlling. It's because He loves us and He knows that that's the best thing for us. And the only way that we can be happy is by obedience to His perfect law, which is, the perfect law of, liberty.
Well, and I think, we know that God winks in our ignorance.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think there's people out there that are devout Sunday keepers that do their best to not do work, and they try to make it a special day and everything else, and they don't know any better. Mm-hmm. And I think that God looks at that with more love than perhaps some people who do know the truth, but then don't do it. Mm-hmm.
That's the other definition of sin, right? Mm-hmm. Sin is not doing the thing that you know is right to do.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, guys, we've had an interesting look at a lot of verses here. Now, I have more verses to discuss, but those are the ones that are, a lot of people will try to use the next verses I have here to kind of say, well, this is our justification for worshiping on Sunday and not worshiping on the Sabbath. So I have several verses to go through, but we're running out of time here today. And so I want to save that for part 3. And then after part 3, let's jump into the history and jump into what's happened outside the Bible between then and now. Guys, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Don't forget to join us back next time for part 3. It's going to be really interesting, and then I can't wait to get into the history. It's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you so much for joining us.